Now, Apeks has added Shox. Now, even though people do love to go with these jokes and they're too simple, like, obviously the one from Tyloo was, somebody from Tyloo, well, that's not respectful, at least give him their name. The joke here, obviously, is why did Apeks sign Shox? Just shouldn't have had him leave Vitality in the first place when they were teammates. Which, fair enough, that at least got a little chuckle out of me, a little titter. That one, at least for a second, did make me smile. But we're talking, obviously, now about Apeks, the organisation, I think Norwegian or something, which famously had in the past the likes of Jacob, and there was actually a rumour a few years back, I think it was last year at some point maybe even, that Rain and the rest of them would go and do a super team there, which never happened with like Jacob and Rubino and those guys. Just wasn't the case, right? We're talking about the lineup though that has a bunch of players you will know in, and now they've added Shox, the player who once upon a time was one of the greatest players of all time, the best player in the world, would be like a first ballot Hall of Famer. And crucially, part of adding Shox is also due to a role swap they've done, because they'd already taken Sticko, famous support player of Mouse Sports. They took him, and obviously recently in Godsend and FPX, and they made him the in-game leader, so he's taken that role on, which makes sense. He was a support player and played with some decent in-game leaders, replacing Asilian, the former Mad Lions in-game leader. And so because Sticko moves to IGL, now they need another player in the team. So they're bringing in Shox and he's coming in, right? I think these are all good gambles. Like, Asilian's decent, but not at the level where the players this level of player can take you to, so he probably did have to be replaced. When you're out there looking for in-game leaders, look, I'd go out there and try and sign Alex or Alexi B or something, but if you can't get those players, they don't want to join or you don't have the money, someone like Sticko's a pretty good gamble. If you look at a lot of the great in-game leaders, they were people who at least at some point in their career played a supportive role. Classic example would be MSL was to support Underglaive, then he became an in-game leader. A bunch of players have played with God B and other teams have done these things. So I think it's not a bad gamble to make. Certainly it doesn't always work. Like, I think NBK is an example where being a support, you had the skills for that, but maybe not the personality to be the leader. And it also sometimes depends what teammates you're paired with and how you balance out the responsibilities and the personalities. So in terms of Sticko, I think he has a decent chance of being a good in-game leader. I do think he's a cerebral player who does his homework, is willing to learn, is willing to adapt, is willing to figure things out. The only issue I would have, which is actually why I think this Shox pairing is going to work, is I think Sticko in his own teams is why I think he actually got a bit cocked and caught from the likes of Mouse. I do think he's had a bit of a daps in him where he hasn't always been as confident in himself, or he's been willing to make room for other people and give them status, and that's been used against him. So if you're the in-game leader, I will say one problem, I think this is in my opinion what Alexi B's problem was in teams like G2, is you've got to have a bit of authority. You've got to get people to buy in. Ideally, you want them to respect you from the outset, and you want people to actually do what you're saying. If they're arguing, or they just don't agree, or they think you're lower in the totem pole and you'll get fired for your bad job, then you're going to be in a bad spot. So in this particular case, I actually think bringing in Shox, who himself has tried IGLing, but surely at this point in his career knows it ain't for him. I think, in my opinion, that's why when he did the existence bring back to G2, that was a sign. He even said it himself. That's where you bring in a real captain. You've realised that him, NBK and the others, they're just messing around trying that role, Apeks, etc. at the time. This is obviously back in 2018 we're talking about. I think Shox is such a respected figure in esports, and this is an international team, so they're going to respect him even more than all the French players who might know him and have beefs with him. He is so respected that he is a voice of authority. He is a guy knows a lot about Counter-Strike. And so in theory, if he actually understands this, he can help Sticko a lot to establish this new leadership structure, to get his calls followed up on, to make the younger and the less experienced players believe in Sticko. He could accomplish so much in that regard if he wants to. And I hope his head's screwed on right in that regard, having seen all the drama in the French scene. Now, what's interesting is he basically implies this himself in the interview. But spoiler, I imagine when they were signing him, since he isn't one of the best players in the world, he understood this is what they wanted from him and this is the right thing to say. So we'll have to see with actions whether it plays out this way, because yeah, the words sound great. He says, I will try to bring my knowledge and experience of the game to help Sticko in his new role. I know he can become a great in-game leader. So the good thing here is, this is another quality I think to make in teams that even I actually missed for a long time in my career. Maybe it's because I'm an autistic person and I wasn't so clued into social cues or like essentially dynamics of personalities, etc. I thought it was just about how good you are at the game, like your knowledge of the game and clutches, like working on this sport with this guy or this style of team. Yeah, there's all that in the game stuff, but I also think as well as having the right skill, as well as having an identity as a team, I think also you need to balance out, keyword balance, youth So inexperience, being young, being vital, having up-and-coming skills, with experience, maybe declining skills, maybe established but known quantities, maybe not as good, but they can still use their brain to win the game, outthink the opponent, bring stuff and add it to the... Because it's when you get the blend, I think, that a lot of the best teams come from. If you just have the old school players, yeah, you're probably going to suffer for something. If you only have the young players and the young fraggers, you're also going to lack a little something. I think it's the blend of the two, and then how far you lean one direction or another, that's what's going to make it interesting. But you'll see when people go to extremes, that's often, I think, what costs them. So the key thing for me here is, one of the reasons, if we rewind all the way back in Shox's career to the beginning of CSGO, when he was coming into Very Games, if people don't know this story, Very Games had lost every single time on LAN to NIP, and in comes Shox, and they didn't even initially win when he came in, but then they did start to win. And one of the factors that they always credited at the time was that because Shox had been the problem child of both Very Games in Source and the French scene, where he would come into teams, he would have disputes with people, he'd go elsewhere, then later on he's so good you have to get him back because he's beaten you, but then you go through the same sort of drama, toxic cycle again and again. What they basically came to the conclusion of in CSGO was, because in CSGO Very Games wasn't the best and they were losing to NIP and existence was a little bit humble to some degree, he actually created space for Shox and allowed Shox to have secondary calls in the team and to have a little bit more say in the mid round. Because if you don't know, Shox's rifle style, it's just part of being one of the best rifles that isn't the first person in every time. Much like a Nico, he was a master if you let him basically be a player alive in the mid-round. He's going to make the right decisions, he's going to attack the right site, he's going to win clutches if he has to, he's going to open up and multi-kill. He was one of the best ever at that. Classically, on the old Dust 2, he was unbelievable on T-side that map. Funnily enough, like Nico and Mousespots a few years later. So if you have a player like that, of course, you want to let that aspect come to play, right? If you have Steeple learning to be an IGL, and then this guy can secondary call and help you out, and he's not overstepping your bounds, but he's adding something, it's going to make the team overall better. And there have been plenty of teams in history, again, where that part's misunderstood. When you know you've got a Carrigan, you maybe can get away without having a great secondary caller sometimes. But you look at some other teams in history, people don't always know. Khan had DSN, Ave had Zonic. These teams, they have a secondary caller. In fact, Glaive himself was a secondary caller for Snappy in Heroic in 2016, if people don't know, on Project X before that. Like, this is part of how these other guys got their shine, but you wouldn't necessarily want the one over the other, except obviously the Glaive one's a rare example. Normally, they have that little strength they can chuck in, which added to the bigger strength, but not complete strength of the IGL, makes it a much better, more complete team. And obviously, when people are alive, they can also take over the IGL and all that jazz as well. That is a real factor, and I think in this team, that might actually work to their favour. Because crucially, this level of team is easily a team Shox is good enough for. I thought he was actually good enough for Team Liquid, just not in that role. I think they had to use a different role, and they did a different set of personalities and coach, in my opinion, if they wanted Shox to work there. But I think you think about what Shox can still bring to the table. He is still a good clutch player. He's still a player who will perform on LAN. Not to the highest level or anything close to years in the past, but still will perform. He won't be a negative. And he has got big game experience, which he can share with people around him. And crucially, and this is a key aspect, they will automatically get a level of confidence from watching and playing with Shox. When you look down the line and you're in a 1v2, everyone on your team's dead, including you, and it's your teammate in a 1v2, but you look down the line and it's Shox, you have a different sense that you're going to win this 1v1. If you're just some random guy there and you're at a massive LAN, you don't feel like that guy's going to win. In fact, now I've left him alive. Now we're probably going to lose the round. I shouldn't have done. You can see how it totally changes your mindset. If instead you look down the line and that's Shox or old school Get Right or the one day Perfecto, you just know you're going to win this round. Or Twists, like, mate, he's going to win it even no matter how impossible it is. When we get back in this game, fuck it, yeah. And now you know you're in a team. It's not just about you, right? Then also, let's add in, he's not a world-class rifler, but he's still a solid rifler. Still has decent aim. In fact, sometimes he even still looks like he has good headshot aim. He's just not a monster like he used to be. So if you think about this lineup, let's just set it up a second, what the lineup of this team is. It's Jacob, the old FaZe Clan 100 Thieves player. I don't even know how this guy slid down to here. Now I do. He made weird choices and went with the Extremum team and then this team here. Because he's always had an element where, because he's from Norway, he's just in a scenario where he doesn't seem to choose the biggest teams. He seems to choose like, sometimes I don't want to be as serious, or I want to play with my friends, or people I like. Jacob's always been a little bit strange like that. That's why he was very up and down in FaZe Clan back in the day. But I thought his period when he was in Renegades and Other Thieves was really good. Look, I'm not saying he was like the top 10 player in the world, but I do think there was times where he was a top 20 player, and I thought as an entry player, he was a really solid player. I'd love to have that guy under me if I was an IGL. So, in my opinion, you add him with Shox, I think that could be a really deadly entry combo, depending on how they're going to play in this team. I actually think he's a player who, again, I was recommending Jacob to teams like Fnatic, certain other squads out there in the world that need to upgrade. I said, I don't care that you haven't seen this name at the top for a while. I think he can do it. I would sign this guy. I think, crucially, he's not a big personality, so he doesn't even have like ego or anything. He's just going to get his job done as he did in 100 Thieves. Then you've got Sticko, another player who no way should be at this level. He's actually a good supportive element / IGL. He was even fragging in Gods at FPX if people don't know. And you go and watch all those POVs. You can see the guy understands the game and studies it. He's a good supportive element. In this case, in-game leader is what he's going to try and do. Then you've got Nork. You see what I mean? This lineup is way better than it has any business being. How are some of the other teams in the world making their lineups and then these players are available? So Nork is the player who was only replaced because Device was available for an IP. Yes, he hadn't hit like good tier 1 LAN AWPer yet. He was still like on the brink for me. But he clearly had some talent and seemed like someone who had a little bit of drive as well. Like, I think if you're talking about I have to bring in an AWPer for a team I'd never heard about before with a bunch of other legit players, this isn't a bad name to ask at this point in time. That's if he's even going to AWP. He could clearly just be a rifler. Then you've got the Lithuanian player JL. Now, all I'll tell you is when he came into the post-Danish Mad Lions, I had a bunch of very legit coach, analysts, like expert type people privately telling me this guy could be one of the next players, mate. Like, he's a real talent. Him and the Waro 2K guy, they were like, they could actually, if this team ever gets to land, do something, and you'll see that like there's talent there, despite the fact you might not know the name. And then that leaves Shox. Dude, where are the weaknesses in this team? There's a pretty nice team. Oh, and did I mention their coach is Cuban? One of the greatest winners in the history of Counter-Strike, the franchise. The guy who won all those majors in 1.6, then was the coach of the legendary Virtus Pro in CSGO. Now, look, he might not have had a great time in the FPX organisation or whatever else he was, coach of Mad Lions or whatever Cuban was doing. But I'll tell you what, I imagine he's a guy who knows Counter-Strike. He's got a lot of experience to share. And he's got a mix here. He's got the youngsters like JL and Nork. Then he's got the older players like Shox and Sticko. And then Jacob's around there or somewhere in the middle. I think this is even a good balance. It's a good balance of nationalities, personalities, styles, level of experience. I think this could be a very interesting team. I don't know how high in the world it could go. The rankings are a mess. They're obviously not going to be a partner team for a bunch of the big orgs. They have to go through qualifiers. And that is a brutal route. As you've seen, even the Astralis of the world could just lose. Remember, they were on land getting top 4 at Cologne, but then they go online and yes, they can just lose in like round 3 of the open qualifier or whatever. That can happen. That's online CS for you guys. So I think there's plenty of prospect in this team. Now, in terms of Shox himself, though, because I always do it like the team adding the move, who they taken out. Here's my problem, though. It is the case that while this is a very interesting prospect, I certainly think it's a very unique pivot for Shox. I do think the fact that Shox has come from Vitality, top team in the world, to here, there have been some mistakes made. He zigged when he should have zagged. First of all, the Team Liquid move was whack. I mean, I'm a big Shox fan. I like some of the players on Team Liquid. In general, I like Team Liquid, the org. But I thought this move never really made much sense because of who he was replacing, what they were trying to get him to do. Like, here's the problem. Shox had to be tailored to, even in the ZWoo Vitality, where he was far from the star player, because they wanted a little bit extra, so they were trying to cater to him a little bit. There's a reason this guy's nickname back in Very Games used to be, and LDLC/Envy, his nickname was Princess. As in like Princess and the P, as in everything has to be exactly how Princess Shox wants it. Otherwise he might get moody. Otherwise he might get upset or he might leave the team. Who knows? That's why he has to have his friend there. That's why they had to practice a certain way. So I did not boot camp too much. Or they had to... He was just a unique guy. Now, that was a while ago, but there's still a little element of that, because I don't think it's that Shox is an asshole now. What I think now is that he wouldn't be a diva, but he just wouldn't be as comfortable. He's someone who's used to, he has to feel a certain way. That's why Shox always emphasises how he's feeling, what the energy levels are, his belief in other people. Very sort of abstract, ephemeral concepts, but clearly it is important to him. It's the heart that beats within his chest. It's the passion that he feels for the game. This is what makes someone like a Shox want to win. So my problem is, I don't think that ever made sense in Team Liquid. All the things I'm describing, he's coming into a NAF who's always looks high / like he's in a nap, sort of like a sloth, like people point out. Elijah's just naturally quite a quiet guy anyway, and his confidence is within his own mind, his thoughts, how good he is, etc. Then you look at the rest of the team, Orsi's just some rook who barely knows you and is used to watching you on videos from 5 years ago, and who else is even in the team at that point in time? Like, exactly. Like, this team was never going to be a world beater, so I think it was a terrible move all around. Never made any sense culture-wise. I would have liked it, both at that time and now, if it could have gone to a real Tier 1 team. Like, that premise I told you earlier about balancing out the young fraggers and the inexperienced ones with the legends. I think this guy could do so much if he was in ENCE with some of their players, or OG with some of their young talents, or another French lineup even. Why not go with an MBK, Kenny S, one of those lineups? Why not make that one? That would be more... listen, the latter wouldn't make as much money, but it'd be more interesting. The former might even be more money than the Apeks team, otherwise imagine they have some cash. And I think would have a much more interesting prospect to go to the top of the world. Even like that Titans team with Sonny and Oscar and those guys in MSL, that would be an interesting team with Shox, right? But luckily, here's the good news. I do think this team can work. And this is the crucial part, at this point in his career, I'm a huge Shox fan, so I just want to see Shox play and compete at Tier 1 on LAN, hopefully. He is a great player, one of the greatest ever. In fact, I would say, even though a lot of people for his resume might not agree, I think until you look at the eye test and longevity, he's a contender for the greatest player of all time in CSGO. And if you know how good he was in CS Source, which I can only slightly attest to, he's a contender for the GOAT of the Counter-Strike franchise. That's a real scenario. He's up there with Forrest and Get Right and those sorts of guys. And by the way, simple, just from what he did in CSGO alone. So I do think he has been a little bit hard done by fans, because I've noticed, as much as everyone claims, like, what do you mean? We respect Source just as much as 1.6. The great Source players don't get the credit for what they did in Source in terms of CSGO, as in they're not made legends from that. Like, the amount of people I've heard disrespect existence for years and years and years and years and years. But then you all are going to cry when I tell you in 2022 that Fallen isn't a great IGL or leader anymore, or player anymore. What is that? Like, you do know existence in Source was the GOAT. You know that, right? Of the IGLs. Then how about this? Shox was a GOAT contender in Source. And like I said, over 2 games has been unbelievable. But he doesn't get the same credit that the great 1.6 players do, and how much they rave about them. I mean, people wouldn't even shut the fuck up talking about Major, the French 1.6 player, who was nowhere close in 1.6 to what Shox was in Source or CSGO, by the way. No way. But people were trying to tell me he's some sort of legend. So, I mean, this just shows you how all over the place fans are. So to me, the key thing is, you got to know who Shox is to know what's possible in his career. Because in terms of mentality, I actually think mentality is the reason his level dropped. It's nothing to do with skill or people catching up or the meta changing or you're just older. I don't think any of that's the case. I've seen the last few years, he still looks like he has the aim, he has the game, he clearly can do the clutches. I think what happened was this. Shox was some sort of a George Best-esque warrior poet who it was all about his passion and his drive, and that his emotions were all over the place, and he was driven to beat this person, then to join that team and prove them wrong, but then take a break, but then actually I want to be a pro again, and then I beat this team over here because I wasn't there when they had all those chokes. I'm Shox, I just walk in and beat NIP a whole bunch of times, I beat Fnatic a few times, and win. This is the thing, Shox, I used to say it's Shox's world and we just live in it. That was the case in 2013, in 2015, in 2016. Even up to 2018, he was running the French scene. He got existence back in the team, got MBK and Apeks kicked out. Like, this guy, there's a reason he was incredibly influential, but the problem is, he's someone where I actually think fixing some things in his real life and addressing some of his baggage might have sapped a bit of his drive in Counter-Strike, because unfortunately, I noticed that when he got his real life to be a better scenario where he has a family and a spouse and a much better real life scenario, that does seem to track with when in the game he's never been the same killer. He's never been the same guy going 10 out of 10. He's never been the same guy where it's like, oh, if he gets back in form, he's going to attempt. He's just been a good player, and he's actually become much more like someone who seems to do it because it's his job, or does it because he just wants to see if he can have some cool last years. It doesn't seem like the same Shox that I remember years and years ago with that same edge to him, which used to, sometimes destroy his own teams, his own teammates, but also could destroy so many opponents and so many other teams in plenty of trophies. Then you got to look, because of that mentality back in the day, every year or so, he was moving between teams. He would never get to stay that long. He would have to come back later. Now it looks like if he actually found a team he was comfy in, his level was decent, he could stay in the team for years. He seems like more of just a role player, and he knows it now. Because I actually do think Shox didn't accomplish everything he could in CSGO. Not only could he have had more years where he was the number one player. I mean, I think he came very close in years like 2016. But crucially, I think he's missing rings. Like, bear in mind, if people don't know the story, the one major Shox won, the DreamHack Winter 2014. I personally I think that's one of the weakest majors won ever, because his team won after losing a best of 3 and didn't replay Fnatic. So in my opinion, if you want to talk about I would say he has no rings right now. Now, there were plenty of other times, DreamHack Winter 2013, you could go to... I mean, obviously, they had a chance for Kovacevicd 2015. If you look at the results before, they'd obviously been beating NIP loads there. He could have won these 2 majors, could have 1 or 2 rings in that sense. But I think he's never had the superstar performance. Like when Kenny S won a major, they gave him the MVP. When other great players, Simple won a major, they gave him the MVP. If Nico wins a major, he'll almost certainly win the MVP. If Zero wins a major, When Shox won his, he was a role player. Even though in other teams he was the greatest player in the world and certainly could have won a major and been a major MVP. So I still think there's a little bit left for Shox. I still think there are some things to accomplish. Look, it's very unlikely you're ever going to get to that level and do it that way, but I still think there are championships to be won. He's won a lot of the smaller titles. He's won a lot of championships, but he hasn't always won the bigger. He hasn't won the Colognes of the world, etc. always, right? So I think there is still something to learn. This video was kindly supported by Kill Your Inner Loser, Ahmed Hadjou, Matt Pugnatio Rajcula, Paul Villa, Travis Goff, Adam Ochs, Animosity, Bot Pounder 420, Hades, Jensen Goh, Kovacevicd, Pacy, Tobias Bernasconi, Tosh, Thooorin, and as always, special thanks goes out to Jerky's Minion. Do you want to suggest a topic or a guest for my shows? Would you like to ask a question in my Patreon AMA? Maybe you want teasers, find out who the next Reflections guests are or upcoming talk show guests. Do you want to take part in one of those long donated discussions with me? Well, if any of the above or more sound interesting to you, put your money where your mouth is. Join the Illuminati today via the Patreon link in the description box below.